The silence that fell over Kingsley's Manhattan restaurant was so thick it seemed to have weight. Conversation ceased, cutlery frozen midair, and dozens of eyes fixed on the small space between the tables. A 10-year-old boy named Lucas Montgomery, visibly shaking, reached out to Diana Johnson, the only black waitress at the establishment. The live piano had just begun a soft melody, and the boy's impulse to ask someone to dance came without warning. Mr. Thornton, the manager, sharply voiced his disapproval, stating it was inappropriate for employees to entertain children in such a setting. Richard Montgomery, one of the richest men in the country, swallowed hard, realizing this was the first time he had taken Lucas out to dinner in public since the accident 2 years ago. Richard Montgomery's jaw tightened as he watched his son struggle to maintain his balance, his legs trapped in metal braces that wavered with each hesitant step. The boy's hand remained extended, trembling slightly, as if waiting for a response from the young woman standing before him. Diana Johnson, barely older than 20 herself, met his gaze with quiet determination. In her 5 years working at Kingsley's, she had learned to become invisible, especially to customers like the Montgomerys. Yet now, in the midst of the growing tension, she refused to shrink away. Instead, she let her eyes drift briefly to the manager, then back to Lucas, as if silently measuring the weight of the moment. She knew what most people didn't, that sometimes, the smallest act of defiance could shift the course of someone's life forever. Diana's decision was not made lightly. She understood the power dynamics at play, the way wealth and privilege often dictated who had the right to be seen and heard. But in that moment, something deeper stirred within her. Perhaps it was the memory of her own childhood, when every request for recognition had been met with indifference or outright dismissal. Or maybe it was simply the unspoken truth that no one, regardless of their station in life, should be denied the dignity of being asked to dance. With a calmness that surprised even herself, she stepped forward, her voice steady yet firm. "I can't dance in an apron," she said, not as a rejection, but as an invitation. Her words carried the weight of both respect and challenge, a subtle assertion that she was more than just a server, she was a person with her own agency and worth. And in that instant, everything changed. Richard Montgomery's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. His son, Lucas, stood frozen in place, his fingers still outstretched, his face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The boy had always been sensitive, perhaps too much so, and the accident 2 years ago had only deepened that vulnerability. Richard had spent those years trying to shield Lucas from the world's harsh realities, keeping him under constant supervision, ensuring that nothing would threaten his fragile progress. But now, watching his son take this unexpected step toward connection, he felt something stir inside him, an unfamiliar mix of pride and fear. He had never considered the possibility that Lucas might lead rather than follow, that he might choose to reach out instead of wait to be comforted. And yet, there he was, standing tall despite the braces that bound his legs, waiting for Diana to accept his invitation. It was a moment that defied everything Richard thought he knew about his son, and himself. Mr. Thornton, the manager, stepped forward, his expression dark with disapproval. "Sir, control your son," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "This is not a dance hall, and our employees are not here to entertain children." The words were meant to assert authority, to remind Richard Montgomery of the unspoken rules that govern the restaurant's hierarchy. But they only served to highlight the absurdity of the situation. Diana Johnson, however, did not flinch. Her hands remained steady at her sides as she met the manager's gaze, unbothered by his condescension. She had spent years learning how to navigate spaces like this, where her presence was tolerated but never truly acknowledged. Yet in that moment, she chose not to retreat into invisibility. Instead, she turned her attention back to Lucas, who still stood there, waiting. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength, "I'd love to dance with you." The words were simple, but they held the weight of a declaration. This was not just a dance, it was a statement, a refusal to be dismissed, a choice to claim a moment of joy in a world that often tried to deny it to people like her. As Diana took Lucas's hand, the room seemed to hold its breath. The clatter of dishes resumed, but the atmosphere remained charged with tension. No one dared to move, as if afraid to disrupt the fragile moment unfolding before them. For Lucas, this was more than just a dance. It was the first time in 2 years that he had initiated an interaction, the first time he had been allowed to lead rather than be guided. His braces scraped against the polished floor as he took a tentative step forward, his body stiff but determined. Diana adjusted her pace instinctively, matching his rhythm, allowing him to set the tempo. There was no rush, no pressure, just a shared understanding that this was about movement, not perfection. Around them, the diners observed in silence, some with curiosity, others with unease. But for the two at the center of the dance floor, the world had narrowed to a single, unspoken agreement. This was a moment of mutual trust, a rare exchange between a boy who had long been defined by limitations and a woman who had spent her life proving she was more than her circumstances. As the music swelled and the dance continued, Richard Montgomery found himself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. He had spent years building an empire, making decisions that affected thousands of lives, yet in that moment, he felt powerless. Watching his son move with such quiet determination, he was reminded of the countless times he had intervened, corrected, or redirected Lucas's efforts. Every misstep had been met with immediate guidance, every hesitation with swift reassurance. But now, something different was happening. Lucas wasn't being helped, he was leading. And Diana, far from being a passive participant, was following with grace and patience, adjusting to his pace rather than dictating it. Richard's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. Was this the result of a stroke of luck, or had Diana somehow orchestrated this? Did she understand his son in a way no therapist or specialist ever had? The questions tumbled through his thoughts, but there was no time to dwell on them. All he could do was watch, helpless yet captivated, as the boy he had once feared might never walk again moved across the floor with a confidence that left him speechless. Mr. Thornton, visibly agitated, approached Richard with a furrowed brow. "Mr. Montgomery," he began, his tone clipped with urgency, "I assure you this will never happen again. She will be properly disciplined." The manager's words dripped with the unspoken assumption that Diana Johnson had overstepped her role, that she had broken an unspoken rule by accepting a child's invitation to dance. Richard, however, did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the pair in the center of the dining room, on the slow, deliberate movements that spoke volumes about trust, resilience, and the quiet strength of someone who had spent years navigating a world that constantly underestimated her. The idea of punishment, of retribution, suddenly felt absurd. Diana had done nothing wrong, she had simply chosen to see Lucas as a person rather than a problem to be solved. And yet, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on Richard's shoulders. He was a man of power, accustomed to commanding respect and expecting obedience. But now, faced with a choice between upholding the status quo or embracing something new, he hesitated. The silence stretched between them, thick with expectation, as the entire restaurant waited for his next move. Richard Montgomery exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into a tight fist before he forced himself to relax. He had spent his entire life making decisions that shaped the fates of others, but in that moment, he realized he had no clear answer. The weight of authority pressed down on him, urging him to restore order, to reaffirm the boundaries that had always defined his world. Yet something in the way Diana led Lucas, in the quiet confidence with which she matched his steps, refused to let him look away. He saw the way Lucas's posture shifted, from uncertain to composed, from hesitant to proud. This was not just a dance, it was a lesson in autonomy, a glimpse of a future Richard had not dared to imagine. And then, without another word to Mr. Thornton, he turned his attention back to the couple on the floor. He needed to speak to her. Not as a patron, not as a customer, but as someone who had just witnessed something profoundly human. As the music continued to play, he stepped forward, his mind already racing with the implications of what he was about to say. Diana noticed Richard's approach almost immediately. She had spent enough time in places like Kingsley's to recognize the telltale signs of someone stepping beyond their usual domain. But unlike the other patrons who had dismissed her presence with polite indifference, Richard was different. His eyes held something close to curiosity, perhaps even admiration, and that alone sent a shiver down her spine. She had expected judgment, or worse, a cold rebuke. Instead, he paused beside her, his gaze flickering between her and Lucas, who was still moving with cautious determination. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice low but unmistakably sincere. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it carried the weight of something far greater. For the first time in months, maybe even years, Richard Montgomery was choosing to listen, to really see, not just as a father, but as a man who had just been humbled by a moment he could not control. And in that instant, Diana knew she had changed more than just a night at the restaurant. Diana met Richard's gaze with measured calm, though inside, her pulse quickened. She had spent years learning to read people, to understand the subtle shifts in their expressions, the hidden meanings behind their words. And in that moment, she sensed something different in Richard Montgomery, a man who had always wielded power effortlessly now standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice steady, neither defiant nor deferential. Then, with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself, she added, "It was an honor." The words hung in the air, not as an empty gesture, but as a statement of mutual respect. For the first time in his life, Richard was not the one dictating the terms of an encounter. He was being offered something unexpected, a glimpse into a perspective he had never considered. And as he watched his son continue to move with newfound purpose, he realized that this was not just a moment of courtesy. It was a beginning. As the final notes of the piano melody faded into the hushed atmosphere of the restaurant, Richard Montgomery found himself standing at a crossroads. The weight of his position, the expectations of his world, and the rigid structure of his life all urged him to return to the familiar. But the image of his son, moving with such quiet determination, refused to fade from his mind. Something in Lucas's expression, shy pride, cautious excitement, spoke of a transformation that could not be undone. And then, there was Diana. She had not asked for anything, had not demanded recognition or reward. Yet in her actions, she had given something far more valuable, the chance for his son to reclaim his own agency. Richard's fingers twitched at his side as he fought the urge to intervene, to correct, to ensure everything unfolded according to plan. But in that moment, he made a choice. He would not dictate the path forward. Instead, he would listen. "Miss Johnson," he said finally, his voice carrying the gravity of a man who had just begun to understand the true meaning of leadership. "My office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Diana Johnson stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the weight of Richard Montgomery's words. The request was unexpected, and yet, she had anticipated something like this. From the moment she had accepted Lucas's invitation to dance, she had known this was more than a fleeting moment, it was the beginning of something larger. Still, the reality of being summoned to the office of one of the most powerful men in the country was daunting. She had spent years navigating spaces where her presence was tolerated but never truly acknowledged, where her value was measured in efficiency rather than humanity. Now, she was being asked to step into a world where her worth might finally be recognized. Taking a steadying breath, she nodded. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice calm, her composure unshaken. Then, turning to Lucas, she added, "Thank you for asking me out." The boy beamed, his smile wide and genuine. For the first time in a long while, he looked happy. As Diana walked away, Richard watched her go, his mind already racing with the possibilities of what this meeting might bring. As Diana disappeared into the bustling crowd of the restaurant, Richard Montgomery remained rooted in place, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The evening had started as a routine outing, a carefully orchestrated attempt to reintroduce Lucas to the outside world after 2 years of isolation. He had anticipated challenges, awkward interactions, moments of discomfort, but he had not expected this. Watching his son take initiative, to step forward and extend a hand not in desperation, but in genuine desire to connect, had shaken something loose within him. For years, Richard had played the role of protector, shielding Lucas from the world's indifference, ensuring that nothing would disrupt his fragile progress. But in doing so, had he also limited his son's ability to grow? Had he, in his well-intentioned efforts, denied Lucas the very thing he needed most, the freedom to lead, to make mistakes, to discover his own strength? The questions gnawed at him, unsettling in their simplicity. And yet, there was no easy answer. What he did know was that the boy before him was changing, and whether he liked it or not, he was going to have to change with him. As Richard returned to his table, the weight of the evening settled upon him like a tangible force. The murmurs of the other diners, the glances exchanged between staff and guests, the lingering tension in the air, all of it faded into the background as he focused inward. Lucas sat quietly, his gaze still fixed on the spot where Diana had stood moments ago. The boy's expression was unreadable, a mixture of awe and something else, perhaps a quiet realization that he had done something unexpected, something meaningful. Richard hesitated before speaking, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. "Why did you do that?" Lucas's question was simple, but it carried the weight of accusation, of confusion. Richard had spent so long dictating the terms of his son's life, controlling the narrative of his recovery, that he had forgotten how to simply be present. Now, faced with a question he had no easy answer for, he found himself at a loss. He wanted to explain, to justify, but instead, he found himself staring at his son, seeing not just the boy he had raised, but the person Lucas had become, someone whose needs and desires he had ignored for too long. The silence between Richard and Lucas stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Richard had spent years ensuring that his son's life was structured, controlled, and safe. He had surrounded Lucas with specialists, therapists, and caretakers, believing that his protection was the best form of love. But now, as he watched his son sit there, still glowing from the experience of taking the lead, he realized that his actions had come at a cost. Lucas had grown up in a world where every movement was dictated, every decision made for him. And yet, in the brief moments of autonomy he had been granted tonight, something had shifted. There was a spark in his eyes, a quiet confidence that Richard had never seen before. It was a reminder that Lucas was not just a project to be managed, not just a child in need of correction. He was a person with his own thoughts, his own desires, and his own potential. And for the first time in years, Richard was confronted with the uncomfortable truth: he had been holding his son back, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of letting go. But now, with Diana's unexpected influence and Lucas's quiet triumph, he was forced to consider a different path, one where he was not the sole architect of his son's future, but a guide, a supporter, a father who could learn to follow as well as lead. As the dinner continued in awkward silence, Richard found himself replaying the events of the past hour in his mind. The boy who had once struggled to walk without assistance was now dancing, not as a patient in need of therapy, but as a child expressing joy. And at the heart of it all was Diana Johnson, a woman whose quiet strength had defied every expectation placed upon her. He had assumed she was just another employee, someone easily replaced, but now he saw her differently. She had not only accepted his son's invitation but had done so with a grace and confidence that suggested she understood something he did not. More than that, she had allowed Lucas to take the lead, to set the pace, to make the choices. It was a radical departure from the way Richard had always approached his son's care. He had spent years insisting on control, on precision, on ensuring that every step Lucas took was the right one. But Diana had shown him that sometimes, the most important progress was not in perfect execution, but in the willingness to try. And for the first time, Richard was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, the way forward was not about guiding Lucas to success, but about giving him the space to find it on his own. As the last remnants of the evening faded into memory, Richard Montgomery found himself grappling with a truth he had long resisted: Lucas was not a project to be perfected, but a person to be understood. The rigid structure he had imposed on his son's life, the relentless pursuit of medical interventions, the insistence on control, none of it had brought the results he had hoped for. Instead, it had created a distance between them, a gulf that neither money nor expertise could bridge. And yet, in the simplest of gestures, an invitation to dance, a willingness to follow, Diana Johnson had illuminated a path forward that Richard had not seen before. She had shown him that progress was not always measured in physical milestones, but in the quiet confidence of a child who was allowed to lead. As he sat in the dim glow of the restaurant, watching his son engage with the world in a way he had never permitted before, Richard felt something shift within him. It was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, undeniable realization: his role as a father was not to fix his son, but to support him. And for the first time in years, he was ready to begin.